The Office of Planning is constantly working to engage the public through new and innovative ways. Today we are testing a new format for the office, a symposium, where we bring together district and national practitioners to share their thoughts, ideas, and reflections on the topic of preserving and planning for progress, how we plan for 800,000 people while preserving our history. We're excited to host this event at the historic Howard Theater, a space whose transformation is a manifestation of the theme of this event. The opportunities and challenges of planning the nation's capital have been the topic of conversations in living rooms, legislative chambers, federal cabinet offices, and the offices of local executives since the establishment of the District of Columbia. We live, work, and recreate in one of the only cities in the nation founded for a specific purpose, to serve as the seat for national government. But from almost as soon as the first cornerstones were laid and the first avenues, circles, and squares were plotted, planning efforts moved beyond the vision of a hallowed monumental city to a reality of urbanization, where officials had to address the needs of residents, supporting the development of housing, commerce, industry, and culture. There was an expectation that the charge of creating great federal places would also apply to creating great places for those living within the district, through strong and responsive architecture, neighborhoods that established unique character and identities, planned open spaces that connected urban dwellers to nature and created sustainable systems, and commercial and industrial centers that embodied and amplified economic opportunity, prosperity, and innovation. In modern times, residents, planners, and elected officials had to not only address the exponential growth that created a metropolis of more than 800,000 people, but also had to work to overcome the scourge of segregation and restrictive covenants that stifled the potential of many residents and the potential of our city as a whole to truly realize its greatness. It was imperative then, as it is now, that we plan for a city where all people, African American and white, those who moved here as a result of immigration from afar or through domestic migration, have the opportunity to thrive as Washingtonians and are fully able to perform their duties as civic actors, contributing to making the District of Columbia a world-class city. It is a charge that my staff and I take on sincerely every day as we work to ensure that the integrity of development within the district is in line with the District Comprehensive Plan entitled Growing an Inclusive City. I was surprised to learn from a peer that Washington is considered a legacy city like that of Detroit or Philadelphia. A legacy city is defined as a city that has lost more than 20% of its population from its mid-century peak. However, he also shared that we are seen as a model for the successful rebirth of a legacy city. Since a population low of, and I have the specific, 572,059 people in 2000, census numbers now show that we have a current population of 672,288. Demographic data shows that our population is growing at about 1,000 people per month. The district's population is projected to exceed 800,000 residents within the next 2 decades. To meet this growth, 150 million square feet of development has taken place within the district since 2000, much of it within our 46 historic districts. While the Office of Planning works closely with our federal planning partners, the National Capital Planning Commission and the Commission of Fine Arts, to maintain the integrity of our place as the seat of federal government, We recognize that we are a great city in our own right and must plan to advance the interest and the opportunities of our residents and neighborhoods. The Office of Planning has the unique charge of making decisions and developing plans that meet the needs of residents, the economy, and the quality of the built environment in the present, while also considering the long-term and collective impact of projects in advancing the long-term vision of the city. In that balancing act, we are the recipients of both ire and accolades from the public on a day-to-day basis. Yes, that actually is true. It's funny because it's true. And while we manage much of the preservation and planning that takes place within the district, I believe that it is up to the community and its leaderships to define progress. I hope that during the upcoming panels that we all reflect on the ideas of success and progress as we hear the stories of the redevelopment of the O Street Market and Woody's Department Store, projects that have catalyzed and transformed the district, and as we hear the remarks of our keynote speakers, Brent and Alfred Fraijo Jr. I would like to thank the staff of the Office of Planning and Executive Office of the Mayor for their hard work in realizing this symposium, and to thank Mayor Muriel Bowser for her support and leadership on preservation and planning issues within the district. So now I'm going to look to the side to see if she's actually there when I introduce her. And there she is. I would like to introduce the Honorable Mayor Muriel Bowser to provide some remarks.
Well, good evening, everybody. I'm very happy to see you all here, and I want to add my thanks to Director Shaw and our team at the Office of Planning. Give them a big round of applause. And I'm happy to see you here to talk about our beloved city and the future of our city, and most specifically, how we will preserve and plan for progress. Everyone in this room knows we can't plan for 2 or 3 years ahead, but we have to start planning in a very meaningful way for the next 10 to 20 years and plan for the change that we know is coming. We know that all of the trends suggest that we will have a population of over 800,000 in the very near years ahead. And I have been told that you have gone around the beautiful and historic Howard Theater looking at pictures of Washington, D.C. During the times when we had over 800,000 people. And since coming to office, I've talked to literally thousands of residents. We've talked in big town halls, in neighborhood meetings, on blocks, and indeed on doorsteps. And at the end of the day, what I'm convinced of is Washingtonians want the same thing, no matter where they live in the city. They want safe neighborhoods, they want vibrant neighborhoods, great schools, effective city services, and they want to know that if they work hard and play by the rules, that they too can enjoy a great life in Washington, D.C. And that is what our administration is all about. A city where every person, regardless of their zip code, has great opportunity. And to be a part of a livable and vibrant community. Our city, we're in a very special time in Washington, D.C. I say frequently that our city has a growing prosperity. And in a city as prosperous as ours, we can really afford to make the investments that will keep our city not only growing, but prosperous for more and more people. The statistic holds till this day that 1,000 people net are added to our population each and every month. Businesses are moving here. People live, work, and play and go to school in places where they did not live, work, and play 20 years ago. That creates pressures on our housing costs. It creates pressures on our city services. And it also creates the pressure on how we have lived and how we think of our neighborhoods. If, for example, we should add density here or remove parking there, or if we support a different type of development that may be suggested for one of our beloved structures. These are all questions that a good comprehensive plan and good planning and people working together towards the same goals will be focused on, but questions also that we won't punt, but questions that we will answer. So our administration is focused on bringing prosperity and answering the challenges or the opportunities of growth across all 8 wards in Washington, D.C. We all have a responsibility to have an eye towards the future. We all know this to be true, that nothing stays the same, right? We'll get better, we'll make investments, but doing nothing doesn't mean that things stay the same in most cases. It usually means that we take steps back. So our modern and growing city deserves a modern plan. And that's why it's so important, and we wanted to have this conversation with you all as we embark on the discussion of our comprehensive plan, which really forms the DNA of our city. We are so grateful in Washington to have groups that are dedicated to making sure that our plans are respected and are in place. And we have citizen and government members of very important boards in Washington. And so I hope that we'll also use this time to think about how we attract people and how we support people who are willing to give up their time to serve on the zoning commission. Are any of our zoning commissioners here? Let's give them a big round of applause. On our Historic Preservation Review Board, or any of our Historic Preservation Board members, give them a big round of applause. And our Board of Zoning Adjustment, give them a big round of applause. There's only 2 of you. You need another board member, right? So thus, you see why I'm talking about our boards and commissions. We know that they serve a very important role, as does the community and other interested stakeholders. All of us working together should contribute to our growth, meet the challenges of a growing and changing city, and be able to build a city and support a city that's reflective of those who have lived here for 5 generations, like the Bowsers, and those who have lived here for 5 minutes, like a growing number of people who call Washington, D.C. home. So our purpose is to listen to some examples from our past, some not too distant, about how we can develop in ways that enhance our communities and how we can be respectful of the values that have represented our growth in Washington, D.C. It is, I believe, in our very near future, that 800,000 residents will call D.C. home again. So we need your input, we need your energy, we need your creativity, and we also need to really forge ideas about how all of the entities I just mentioned, the public sector and the private sector, can work together to keep our city on a path towards progress. So we need a couple of things specifically. We want everybody to participate in our strategic planning for public spaces and parks. Give us your good ideas on how we can improve transportation, walkability, public health, and sustainability, and work with my team to identify great people who are willing to help, either when we have openings in the government, when we have openings on our boards and commissions, and certainly when we have opportunities for feedback around our comprehensive plan. So thank you for coming out, and I look forward to hearing your good ideas and working with you day to day. Have a great one.
Mr. Shaw told me that we were the keynote speakers, and what that meant for him, at least, is that we wanted to shake things up. So I'm hoping we get a chance to do that. As was mentioned, I've been really blessed with an opportunity to work with really extraordinary developers throughout the country, in particular in California, where I'm based. I started an organization that is a think and do tank in Los Angeles that's dedicated to capturing the entrepreneurial spirit of working class communities, communities that are struggling, communities that are operating and thriving in informal economies. And I also founded the organization that's building this park. For me, having said all of that and that my formal experience, really what motivates me is where I grew up. And the fact that I was born to a farm worker, I was born to a father that left middle school, quit school to work in an orange orchard to support his 8 siblings, worked as a truck driver, and died as a result of working in hazardous conditions as a truck driver. I lived in poverty. I like to say that I went to Harvard College and I took my first Econ 101 and discovered in college, freshman year, that I had been living below the poverty line all my life. It's hard to see that when you're surrounded by people like yourself that are trying to earn a living and get ahead. So I grew up poor. I went to a high school that had a 70% dropout rate. I grew up moving from one apartment to another. I grew up struggling to try to figure out where my family was going to be at any given time. I grew up on welfare. My mother, after my parents divorced, had to get on public assistance to get ahead. And so with all the formal education that I have, my work is inspired by that experience and that sense of ethic and motivation to do something different. And so what I wanted to let you all know is that when I think about preservation, I think about people, not buildings. If you focus on people and you focus on community, good building, good preservation will come. Next slide, please. So for me, the idea of preservation is about transformation. It's about acknowledging that buildings are operating in a context, are operating in neighborhoods and many times that are struggling with forces of gentrification. And for me, as part of my practice is the opportunity to begin to deal with the issue of gentrification. And the way that I put that into practice is by embracing the notion that, for me, preservation is about transformation. It's about embracing change. It's about embracing, as I told Brent, the idea of gentrification as an opportunity to better our neighborhood, so long as the change that happens is dictated by the folks that live in these neighborhoods. I started doing that by the next slide. I started doing that by beginning to experiment with some of the abandoned industrial buildings in an area of Los Angeles that is in the epicenter of the gentrification and the changes that are happening in Los Angeles. And I had been working with organizations that were really focused on opposing the idea of reinvestment in their neighborhoods because of the fear that comes with displacement. And so what I wanted to propose was an alternative idea, not necessarily a solution, but rather just an idea to explore on whether this was possible to do. So I basically put my wallet where my mouth is. I decided to take the savings that I had. I'm starting a family with me and my partner, so it took a lot of convincing. But I partnered with the local bank and bought an industrial building in my neighborhood and said, this is where gentrification begins to change. This is how we are going to be in charge of changing our neighborhood. So we took this abandoned, beat-up industrial building, which is about 6,400 square feet. We decided to integrate a series of studio spaces after doing a lot of TI improvements. And we can talk later, but the idea of deferred maintenance with a lot of these buildings in the hood is a real barrier to the opportunity to beautify our neighborhoods, because a lot of the folks that actually still own these buildings are not invested in the buildings, are not invested in the neighborhood. But we spent the 18 months to renovate the building. And before we were even done, we were at capacity in terms of the tenants that we had. We have below market rates for all the tenants. We opened up the first LGBT resource center in the history of Boyle Heights in my neighborhood. We're doing HIV testing. We have other generations, older individuals, LGBT tenants. My mom came to the opening of the building, which was really exciting and moving for me to have my mom, who, as I mentioned, we always rented, never owned anything, come to see what's possible when you partner with people that have the same vision for you and that you actually believe in the neighborhood. And having that ability to really operate from the faith that the neighborhood has all the essential ingredients that they need to be successful. It's just a matter of tapping into that energy. As I mentioned, so City Labs is a project that I started in 2014 as my business. It's one of my personalities. Eric sometimes talks about me having a personality disorder because I do wear different hats and do different things, but I'm happy to talk more about this project. Next slide. And let's go to the other slide for a second. So one of the things that we did is that we partnered with the California Endowment, and one of the units is now a curatorial space for local artists that are makers in the neighborhood. My favorite artist there is this woman called Anna. She designs and makes acrylic nails. She's calling it cha-cha nails. And it's amazing. She sells it in the neighborhood. She has her studio there. She makes the product there, and she invites folks to actually come and experience her space. We've had thousands of people. She has enormous amounts of followers on Facebook, and now she's operating in the neighborhood that I think she's going to continue to thrive in. The other, next slide. Okay, so this slide here is about adaptation. One of the things that I wanted to mention is sort of taking it outside of the building context is, as we deal with a lot of other improvements in our neighborhoods that are aging, like infrastructure, the idea to experiment around these facilities and try to make them multimodal, try to make them multidimensional and actually serve neighborhoods. I grew up in a neighborhood in LA that is 30% freeway, 30%. We have 6 major state highways. The benefit is I can get to, a lot of places in 20 minutes, like all Angelinos say. But the truth is that results in greater incidence of asthma. And so one of the things that we're experimenting with these infrastructures is to try to cap them. We're taking the 101 freeway, as was mentioned in the introduction, where it goes below grade between Santa Monica Boulevard and Hollywood Boulevard, a mile-long stretch of the freeway, and we're merging the bridges together to create green space in the park poorest neighborhood of California. The park poorest. You have 80,000 children living within walking distance of one of the most trafficked freeways. And coming together as a neighborhood and thinking about what we can do and creating literally something out of thin air is an extraordinary opportunity, but something that requires that sort of level of ingenuity. And the idea is that we can take existing facilities and try to readapt them. Next slide. That's a freeway there. It's 44 acres. In the heart of Hollywood. The East and West Hollywood will be combined and merged as a result of this. They've been separated by the freeway for the past 50 years. And finally, the next slide. That's the before and after pictures of what we're proposing to do, which is an extraordinary transformation of the neighborhood in so many ways. Not only in the idea around the issue of the health benefits for folks that live near green space, but also job creation, and the idea of creating greater safety, the idea of ensuring, we're working right now on adopting an overlay plan that would actually ensure that the development that is spurred by the green space here, like the High Line, we capture that benefit to create additional affordable housing. And so myself as a land use lawyer, I get to use my skills in creating that overlay to ensure that future families have the access to this enormous and incredible green space. Finally, I think preservation is about innovation. It's about the ability to think creatively to promote form as well as content, to take and pilot temporary uses and try to use them in a way that actually builds from within, builds from the energy that is in that neighborhood. I'm looking currently, I had the opportunity to work with the largest utility in the United States on a surplus property site in the Bay Area, an area of San Francisco that is actually experiencing extraordinary gentrification. And we're taking a 50-year-old power plant and thinking through how we can actually repurpose a power plant and the surrounding facilities for the benefit of the neighborhood. The way that we're doing it is by deploying some innovative community engagement efforts. We've partnered with StoryCorps. We've partnered with Liz Ogbu, which many of you may know, around community engagement. We have temporary hubs. We're building these pods on site to pilot temporary uses that are actually created and run by the local neighborhood to test the need, not only sort of to match the services with demand, but really an opportunity for us to experiment on whether these uses are viable and making the case for future developers that these uses should be integrated in the permanent development that we know will come. And so the idea is really there trying to apply different creative tactical strategies that we hope will build new development, will create change in a way that actually preserves neighborhood and doesn't displace neighborhood. Next slide. Next slide. That's the picture of the Hunters Point power plant that I'm talking about, surrounded by the new stadium, surrounded by UCSF's new medical facility. And so it really is sort of at the epicenter of some of the gentrification forces that are happening. And I'm probably out of time. But the other couple slides just have some images around what we're doing. Another piece that we're talking about is that the power plant was operating for more than 50 years in this area. And so it was a real barrier between the neighborhood that's a little bit more uphill and the water. So one of the first activities in construction work that we're doing is actually what I refer to as creating a new baseline. We're building public space so that whatever comes after that public space has to necessarily be oriented to accommodate these new public amenities that we're ensuring the community has. The community is designing those amenities. We're opening them up for recreational uses, which is what some of the folks that we did charrettes with. We worked with a lot of youth in the area. One of the kids wanted a dinosaur park, so we're looking at integrating recreational activities, maybe not, sort of large dinosaurs, but activities that I hope continue to engage the neighborhood there. And finally, what I want to do is, and it's been touched on previously, because a lot of these projects that I'm working on is taking not necessarily historically significant buildings, but buildings that are there, that are part of the fabric of the neighborhood, and beginning to repurpose them. And so as I was preparing for our discussion tonight, I was struck by this quote. If you go to the last slide. That slide there. A quote by two architects that are taking former public housing and actually, rather than demolishing them, not because they don't think they might create more opportunities for additional development, but rather because they want to preserve the existing fabric of people that are living there. And rather than demolishing them, they're adding. And they're bucking the traditional trend that it's more expensive to preserve than to rebuild anew. And for me, I want to flip around those discussions and equations around what's more expensive, what's the cost? Is it just about money? Is it about an opportunity to create something more valuable? Is it an opportunity for us to preserve what's already there and add? Maybe the more challenging piece of it, as was already discussed by Douglas Development, is an opportunity to really, the creativity comes from that challenge of adding and integrating and preserving and enhancing rather than destroying. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. Well, I thought I would do my presentation a little differently than normal. So there will be no photographs of historic buildings. And I thought I would tell my journey, my preservation story, how I came to what I think is very important work. Because preservation is really about people, and it's about stories. So I was raised in a little small town called Paducah, Kentucky, and I remember being with my twin brother, and my parents would take us down this street called Jefferson Avenue. And we would look out the window and we would play this game. This is where I'm gonna live, when we would see these historic houses. And he'd say, no, this is where I'm gonna live, that's my house. And we loved it. And we had this appreciation for these historic buildings, but we had no understanding of historic preservation in a formal sense. You know, my parents never talked about historic preservation. It was nothing that we understood, but we cared about history. We cared about our family's culture and memory. Fast forward a couple of years later, I would go to University of Kentucky. So I got an MBA, wanted to be a real estate developer, still do in many ways. And once I graduated, I was still searching for my professional identity. So I had this random 15-minute conversation with the dean of the graduate program at Historic Preservation at the University of Kentucky. After 15 minutes, I ended up submitting my application. 2 months later, I started the graduate program. I was the first African American to go into the program and the first person with an MBA. So of course, they would ask me to work on an African American preservation project. So I had the good fortune to conduct a statewide inventory of historic roads and wall schools in Kentucky. I'm sure many of you have heard of roads and wall schools. For those that hadn't heard about them, so this is a massive school building program that was envisioned by Booker T. Washington. It was funded by Julius Rosenwald, who was the second president of Sears and Roebuck. Together, they helped to fund the construction of over 5,000 schools in 15 southern states. I mean, amazing. I mean, I knew about Booker T. Washington. I had read Up From Slavery. You know, he was iconic for me, but to know that he had this kind of impact, that he created this kind of social movement. The initial architects were Robert Taylor, the first African-American graduate, professional architect in the United States, first black graduate from MIT, and the early landscape designer was George Washington Carver. During this process, I learned that my mother and father attended Rosenwald schools. I had this connection to these historic buildings and these iconic figures in history like never before. I could see, I could touch, I could smell, I could hear the creaking floorboards as I walked inside these often forgotten and abandoned buildings. And I then remember thinking about the quiet power of historic preservation to bring the past into the present, unlike any other form of history. That was powerful for me. Preservation made Washington and Rosenwald's lives once lived real, and I knew that there was continuity in that story, that my life was directly impacted by Booker T. Washington's vision for uplifting the black community. Oh, next slide. Next slide. So once I graduated from that program, I started working for the National Trust, and that took me to Boston. So that was in 2005. I had a fantastic director that understood that the traditional preservation movement hadn't directed resources to help uplift this grassroots movement of African Americans and their allies that had been working to save this history. So it allowed me to be a visionary. It allowed me to conduct research and understand what the gaps were in the market. We were able to develop the Northeast African American Historic Places Outreach Program. Over 4 years, that was funded by the 1772 Foundation, brought in over $1 million in construction funding, developed an award-winning board building capacity program. You know, we were able to do some really great work. But when I first moved to Boston, I lived in a neighborhood called Beacon Hill. I'm sure many of you have heard of that place. Well, I had never been to Boston before I started working at the Trust. I didn't know about Beacon Hill. I just knew I wanted to get rid of my car, and I wanted to be able to walk to work, and it was centrally located. I then found out that this is an urban, free black community with long historic roots. This is where the abolitionist movement was founded in the United States. I realized that I lived 1 block down the street from the African Meeting House, constructed in 1806, commissioned by, designed by, and paid for by a free black community. And this building is where Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, Harriet Tubman, and other luminaries strategized and created the abolitionist movement, but strategized a plan to end slavery in America. I realized every single day when I was being immersed in this living history, the power of historic buildings to make me think about my responsibility. What gifts will I bring to the world? I started to think about, how the African Meeting House elicited a sense of curiosity within me. It made me think about my own identity, and it made me proud to be Black. That was powerful for me. Next slide. After being there for 8.5 years, I would relocate 2 years ago, still working for the National Trust, and I would get the chance to come to Washington, D.C., to be in a historic Black city with so much African American history, so much American history. What I started to realize is that DC is at the cutting edge of historic preservation if we're looking at it through the lens of history. And what I find beautiful here is the federal government, through the National Park Service, we preserve the Carter G. Woodson home. We preserve Mary Church Terrell's house, Mary McLeod Bethune's house, Frederick Douglass's home. These iconic figures in American history and Black history. Black spaces, Black culture, and Black identity, it matters. Historical figures in history matter. But what I think DC is doing well, the progress that's been made here, is the way that it is shifting the definition of historic preservation. So it's not just about old buildings, but it's about contemporary architecture. So when we look at the National Museum of African American History and Culture that's built on the National Mall, that building is embodied with historical awareness and Black and African American and African culture. If you look at the Chuck Brown Memorial, it is embedded with African American culture and identity. That's powerful that contemporary new architecture can communicate our history. When I look at the Mies van der Rohe building that has been named after Martin Luther King Jr., and that we are actually honoring important figures in Black history by giving them that kind of placement on such important buildings, that's powerful. When we look at the sculptures and the use of art to commemorate the past, like the Carter G. Woodson sculpture, we're looking at the Mary McLeod Bethune sculpture, or looking at the art murals that exist around the city. Preservation has been redefined. It is a more cultural approach. And so when I think about Washington, D.C., I think that we have made good progress in our effort to preserve Black culture, Black identity. And I just want to close by saying that this is a really important year. So we know that this is the 100th celebration of the National Park Service. It's the 50th anniversary of the National Historic Preservation Act. But there's a lesser known anniversary. In 1916, the National Association of Colored Women organized a national campaign to raise $20,000 to pay off the mortgage of Cedar Hill, to wire it with electricity and to open it up to the public, which they did in 1922 to receive 4,000 visitors on the very first day. I feel like the formal African American preservation movement is founded here in Washington, D.C. So I hope with all of this brain power, with all of these resources, that we can shift part of our attention to Anacostia. How can we use living history to immerse this blighted historic neighborhood that's anchored by one of the most important sites in American history? That's what I want us to think about. We can talk about that a little bit later. Thank you.
All right, so we've brought you guys here to talk about DC, but to talk about it from your diverse perspectives, from work elsewhere, from your observations here. And I think I want to pose the same question to both of you to start off, which is, The topic today is the city is growing. We know it's growing. There are lots of new people coming. What do you, with all of your various experience, and Alfred, I'll start with you. What do you worry about the most with a city experiencing this kind of growth? And as you put it, gentrification, that's happening too, right? If you were in charge of planning for the future of DC, what would keep you up at night?
So two things. One is bad design. One of the developers mentioned, perhaps the architect mentioned, that we're building for, we're not building for 20 years, we're not building for 50 years, we're building for 100 years, and I really believe that. The thing that actually physically impacts me and depresses me is to look at bad buildings. Buildings that are not just aesthetically deficient and depressing, but buildings that are not oriented from a human aspect, from the issue of walkability, from the issue of multi-generational accessibility, from the issue of transparency, from the issue of being oriented towards the public, to be oriented towards imagination and creativity. And I think every building that has the privilege of being built in America should have a sense of ethic for the neighborhood it's built in. And so for me, that's one. The other is, and I have the opportunity to work with really great architects, so I feel blessed in that regard. And the other thing is that in regards to the kinds of creative uses that we're seeing in the creative rehab of older buildings, historic buildings, as we think about the new sort of retail experience and we think about the new sort of demographics about folks that are accessing, I think for me, my greatest concern and the thing that I'd like to bring forth in the, before you all is to think about different demographics, to think about, sort of the range of small businesses and big businesses, to think about the fact that there's people that are tapping into, as millennials, we like to talk about the co-working spaces. When we talk about, sort of collaborative hubs and the like, which is a trend in a lot of urban communities. And think about the people that are accessing those. Who are they? Are they really diverse? Are they really paying less rent? If you do the market analysis around these, quote, creative alternative office spaces, the square foot price of those creative alternative office spaces are actually higher compared to traditional space. So who are we tailoring to? Who are we making these spaces available to? The thing that I wanted to do for the co-working spaces I created is that I wanted to tackle that issue. Because unless we start tackling the issue of economics and what's affordable and what people can do with these buildings, we're not really democratizing the new urbanism that we're experiencing. We're not really advancing the neighborhoods in our city in a way that's open for everybody, for all kinds of entrepreneurs. So for me, I'm offering below market rate, and guess what? I can still pay my mortgage. It's not bankrupting me. It's you have to have an ethic in how you do your business, and a commitment to neighborhoods.
Alfred, I want to follow up on this because how do you see that sort of ethic developing in your community, and like where did it come from for you?
I mentioned what I'm doing. What I'm doing. In terms of what I'm doing is, I feel a sense of a desperation. Our communities are really struggling, and the new economy is not really catching everybody. People are still really struggling. And so for me, with these folks, two things. One is people are really struggling, and two, which I mentioned to Brent earlier and I feel passionate about, is that our communities, and what I mean by our communities is communities of color, communities that are disenfranchised, communities that are in the informal arenas, communities that are not really talked about when we talk and study millennials, communities that are not educated. All those folks are not getting caught up, but you know what? Like my parents, when they came to this country to make a better living, my mother that was given away by her parents, that was adopted by a woman that was an alcoholic, that came to the United States and still made a living for herself. That's my inspiration. You tap into the energy of ingenuity of immigrant communities. You look at what they're doing with small businesses and how they're making ends meet and how they're seeking alternative forms of financial structures. That's where the creativity is at. Let's tap into that. Let's bring and celebrate those things. You know, I often talk about this notion of sustainability and LEED certification like it's a new thing. Working class communities, poor communities have been saving and reusing forever. It's not a new trend, but it's who's talking about it. It's who is packaging it. It's who has that TED Talk. It's who has the microphone. And my responsibility, because I've been extraordinarily blessed, is to be able to bring voice to those communities and enable them. The requirement for you to be able to work in the space that I created is that you have a mission-oriented philosophy for your business and serve the neighborhood. That's the benefit. And people really need space for that. And I'm willing to say here, for the developers that are in the room that I work with on a daily basis, it can be profitable. It can be done if we do it right. Sorry.
No, don't be sorry. Brent, I imagine there are some things about what Alfred just said that you agree with, but I want to give you a chance to respond to it, but also want to just point you back to my sort of original question, which is I'm curious about where you're coming from. You know, what are some of your biggest worries when you look at a city like DC, especially now that you're here, from a preservation perspective?
For me, it's about displacement. When I think about DC, it's a historically black city. We've seen historic black neighborhoods since the 1930s be impacted by this slow pace of gentrification and displacement. The population loss because of the rising rents that are impacting those that are most disadvantaged, that have historically not had the income to acquire and own their own historic properties. There's always been this sense of temporary space that they've lived in. I want to shift that. I think the issue is really about an economic model. There's so much investment that's coming into DC. We are literally in a renaissance at this moment. So how can we use historic buildings to create a homeownership program? How can we use the history and align it with a place like Cedar Hill and be intentional in curating and programming that neighborhood by attracting nonprofit managers and academics and activists and creating a community that is not necessarily gentrified, but that has income diversity. That's what I'd like to see is new ideas, new approaches to rebuilding communities, and we can use preservation as a tool to do that.
Alfred.
I was thinking about the issue myself, having gone to college, having graduated from law school, and the first thing that I did after I went to law school, I came back to my neighborhood where I grew up. And I bought a home, and the first thing I did was tear down the fence as a statement. You know, when does a community not become safe? Who gets to decide? When do we make that decision? But also, as a gay man, as an educated man, as a Latino, a lot of people saw me as a gentrifier. You know, I was sort of in this moment of sort of split personality where I was really sort of caught in this conundrum. And what I want to convey is that I'm all about the free market. I'm about opportunity. I'm about different product, for different kinds of people. But I think that there is some more sort of level of diversity that we need to tap into that hasn't really, we're not really sort of capturing. But for me, that was sort of a clear moment when I thought, we need more people like me. We need more folks that are coming back to the neighborhood that would like amenities and services to better the neighborhood. It's about that diversity, and it's about having a larger discussion of what change means and for whom.
So we've been having on citylab.com, the site that I edit, we've been having a little bit of a running debate about whether or not there's a tension between cities that are dealing with affordability crises, like DC, like a lot of cities that have seen, and of course these are sort of high-class problems, right? We have an affordability crisis, and that also means that a lot of people are doing better and other people are being left behind. But we ran kind of a point-counterpoint on the site. One was written by one of my staff writers, and one was actually written by your boss, the head of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Making the case that, especially in the case of historic districts, that perhaps we ought to be having a bigger conversation about whether or not regulations and rules that apply to those districts might be, in fact, contributing to our affordability issues. So I wondered if both of you, we're talking about displacement, we're talking about preservation, and this has been a broader debate that's been kind of going on our side on Twitter ever since. I would love to hear what both of you have to think about that particular topic.
Well, I'll start. So I think in historic districts, they offer a lot of value because, of course, they're protecting history. But then in marginalized and diverse communities, there's a lot of change over time. Buildings have been adapted. A lot of buildings are small, unadorned, vernacular spaces, and they have lost their integrity. Then when they are evaluated through the traditional preservation lens, that becomes an issue. I'd love to see us to be more flexible. And I might be criticized by my colleagues for saying this. I consider myself more of a liberal preservationist, but I think that we have to be flexible, not only in our zoning policies and creating overlays that allows us to allow for really new and innovative uses, especially in existing residential spaces, but how can we allow the property owners to reimagine these spaces, intervene in really cool ways, and but also contribute, also provide a sense of investment that responds to the needs of that community. African American historic places, like I said, are simple. You think of like Latino communities. I have a colleague that's based in Houston, and we talk about this, the contradiction between authenticity and integrity all the time, and how that impacts Latino communities, because preservation means something different to them than it does to the Black community, that it does to the traditional preservation community. So we have to be more flexible in our approach.
Amen. I totally agree with that. And it relates to one of the initiatives that we have in the work that I'm doing is to try to create more diversity in who's making decisions around land use in our cities.
Hey, Alfred, can you tell us a little bit more about it's the Leadership for Urban Renewal Network?
Yes. So the Leadership for Urban Renewal Network is a nonprofit that got started in my office because I wanted to get a bunch of crazy professionals in different disciplines together to think about some of the issues around the urban, sort of the urban context that we were not able to experiment or sort of tackle questions that my developer friends and my community activist friends and my architects and organizers and planners. We sort of clicked. We really liked working with each other, and we had a basic premise that we were going to try to stay as innovative and create a laboratory for new ideas and test. We don't test ideas as often. As a planning department, as the Office of Planning, it's about testing It's about going a little bit, beyond what's in the book. As a lawyer, we're sort of trained to do that. And as planners, I see that as well. But try to be a bit more experimental, and see what sticks and test ideas. When we begin to question the fact that our zoning code and our development regulations in most urban areas are more than 50 years old. And most of them were written by people that don't look like us. There's an opportunity to really reinvestigate that and really rethink that. And we started with the basic premise. When we've been working on, for example, issues of street vending and informal economies in the U.S., in the city of LA, our attitude is that if you live in the city, if you walk and ride the bus or drive to work, you're an expert planner. Okay? Your ideas are probably more important than mine and most planners that are in the tower in downtown LA. Okay? You talk to that mobile vendor, that woman that is walking the streets for 13 hours a day. You get to talk to her about the things that she's experiencing, about what she adds to the life of the fabric of her neighborhood, and the idea that more eyes in the street of these mobile vendors, which by the way are illegal in the city of LA, which by the way were banned in the early 1900s, and are now illegal. You talk to her, she has amazing things to say about what's possible in the city of LA. And you have to tap into that. We've had over 30 different charrettes on just the issue of, I'm getting the time card, on just the issue of mobile vending. And it doesn't make sense. Mobile vending is proliferating. Why? Because you have creative entrepreneurs that are not documented or don't have formal channels to get a regular job that are saying, you know what, I have a family to feed and I have a product that is meeting demand. Why not tap into that? What is wrong with that? That's the crucible of entrepreneurship in the country. That's what built this country. And here we are in a modern city, the only city of all the 14 major metropolises in the country that bans creative entrepreneurship in the streets. Let's start there.
Brent, you brought up, and we are running out of time, but I want to make sure and prod you a bit more on your sense of hope or lack thereof for the fact that we haven't seen the same kind of redevelopment in Anacostia that we've seen in Shaw here or in other neighborhoods. And what are the opportunities that you see the city missing? I mean, if you were able to just get a whole bunch of balls rolling at once, how would you do it?
I think you used the key word, hope. So again, preservation is about social impact. I hope that we can increase that. And I want you all to partner with the National Trust for Historic Preservation. We have a program called HOPE Crew. It stands for Hands-On Preservation Experience. We are working in diverse communities with disadvantaged populations, building their skill sets in preservation trades, construction trades. I've seen all these amazing real estate projects. Why don't we partner together? Why don't we work with youth corps and African American, Latino, and other diverse communities and give them a skill that will help them to be able to have resources that will help them to feel more empowered about themselves. So let's increase the social impact.
All right, I want to thank you both. Thanks, everybody.